Hi, so I know I'm on a bit of a roll. This is my third or fourth video today, but I couldn't let this one pass because I consider it to be very good news. And to cut straight to it, basically the two Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, the two Canadian nationals who have been held arbitrarily in China for almost 3 years, have been released. This is great news. It's a case I follow quite closely, and it will be huge relief to their families when they touch down on Canadian soil. I've double checked this in several sources, but sometimes with something like this, there could be false news, false leads. Um, Earlier today, there was news that Meng Wanzhou, I mentioned this briefly in my other video, had been struck in a deal with, or rather, her case had resulted in a deal being struck with American prosecutors, or I think actually it was a Canadian court that struck that deal or made that ruling. And she made a speech about being a mother and so on. I'm not going to condemn her. I don't know about her guilt or innocence, but I do know this. The way she was treated in Canada was a lot more fair than the way the two Michaels were treated in China. She had full due process. She had protesters on her behalf. She had fair treatment in the media. She was under house arrest, but that was in a fancy mansion in Vancouver. Contrast that to the prison conditions that the two Michaels were under. The fact these men had very limited access to their family, to lawyers, and certainly very little in the way of due process. Now, the Chinese regime has said they were always treated fairly and it had sufficient grounds to hold them on. But I think the fact that these men have been released now, coming so soon after her release, just reiterates that this was nothing but petty revenge by Beijing. Because if they were really guilty, if Beijing thought these men were really guilty, why would they just release them like that? I think what's happened is they now know they have no bargaining chip because their citizen is going back to China, so they know they can no longer put up this facade of, suggesting that these guys were guilty. Frankly, I don't believe they were guilty, because I think if they were, China would have instantly produced something. I mean, this is a totalitarian state. If these men were guilty of espionage or something like that, China would not hesitate to show it, because they would want to make themselves look like the innocent party. I think the truth is they targeted these men as Canadian nationals out of petty revenge because they were angry that their citizen had been arrested. Now, whatever people think of her arrest, as a Huawei executive, she'd been accused of violating sanctions against Iran. Whether, she's innocent or not, I don't know. But she has been treated a lot fairer. So for the Chinese side to claim that, this poor woman has been treated badly, I'm afraid I look at that with a pretty dim view. Um, but, it's great news for the two Michaels. This has been reported in the Hong Kong Free Press, and this is a quote. These two men have gone through an unbelievably difficult ordeal for the past 1,000 days. They have shown strength, perseverance, and grace, and we are all inspired by that. That's a quote by Justin Trudeau. Um, and Trudeau has said that it's the work of Canadian diplomats that have enabled this to happen. It greatly soured relations between Ottawa and Beijing. So yeah, just to reiterate what happened earlier, a Canadian judge ended extradition proceedings against Meng and lifted her bail conditions, allowing her to return to China for the first time since her arrest in Vancouver's International Airport at the behest of U.S. authorities on December the 1st, 2018. The Canadian judge's move followed an agreement she made with the US Justice Department to suspend fraud charges against her. So clearly there's a lot of politics going on in the background. Both Kovrig and Spavor were put on trial in March of this year. In August, Spavor was sentenced to 11 years in prison, while there had been no decision in Kovrig's case. Trudeau previously denounced Spavor's sentence as unacceptable and unjust and said the charges were trumped up. Uh, on Friday, he said these two men have gone through an unbelievably difficult ordeal. That's the quote I mentioned. Their families at the beginning of September led hundreds of supporters marching 7,000 steps through the Canadian capital. The same number Kovrig said in letters to his family he walked in a small cell every day to bring attention to the detention. Representatives of 26 countries had also gathered outside the building in Beijing, where his closed door trial was held in August. Canadian diplomats were also barred from attending Spavor's trial in the northern city of Dandong. They had almost no contact with the outside world since their detention, and virtual consular visits only resumed in October 2020 after a 9 month hiatus that authorities said was due to the coronavirus pandemic. Well, that's BS because COVID wouldn't have stopped a virtual meeting being set up. There would have been no physical contact, so that's just an excuse by Beijing. Um, Beijing had insisted the detention of the two Canadians was lawful, while calling Meng's case a purely political incident. Ottawa, meanwhile, had rallied allies, including the United States, to decry what it called China's arbitrary detention of its nationals, and I believe they also accused Beijing of hostage diplomacy, which I completely agree with. I think that's what Beijing done. Um, but this case, firstly, it's great news for these two guys. They will need to be given all the support that it's not going to be like they just go back and that's it. They might have post-traumatic stress. God knows what they've been through. Um, it's going to take time to adapt to a free society again, to settle in. I imagine they'll just want peace and just to be with their families. But they need to be given all the resources in terms of mental health care, in terms of anything else that may come that way. But this case also reiterates why Westerners need to be very, very careful in China. Now, I'm a Westerner. I've worked in China. And my honest experience is that in terms of your reception, the Chinese are great hosts. They're generous, they're helpful. And in my experience, my colleagues, I worked at a large high school, my colleagues and my company were very good. They were very welcoming. They went out of their way to make me feel welcome. So I have no complaints about that. But I was constantly aware that I was in a single party state. I was constantly aware that I had to be assertive. And if I did get into trouble, I'd have very, very few rights. Because remember, you're also in a state where the media is 100% controlled by the ruling regime. So the two Michaels were never going to get a fair coverage, Chinese media. Goodness knows how Chinese media is covering this. They're probably reporting about China's great generosity in releasing them, when the truth is they had minimal reason to hold them in the first place. But um, honestly, at this point, I would say if you're a Westerner, especially, well, frankly, anyone, but if you're a Westerner, um, please, please think very carefully before working in China. It's a great country, it's a fascinating country, and the Chinese people are welcoming. But if anything goes wrong in terms of international relations, you could well find yourself being used as a pawn. You could find yourself arrested on trumped up charges when you've done nothing wrong. Um, or it might be a case that there's a minor indiscretion, like maybe your visa's out of date, but they will use that as an excuse to trump up something more serious, like espionage. So honestly, at this point, I would say think carefully before going to China. I would frankly tell people not to do it at this point. I think the risk in terms of geopolitical tensions is too high. And the rhetoric about a new Cold War, this kind of looks like a Cold War scenario, almost like an exchange. And that isn't formally the situation, but it just seems like a profound coincidence. China releases these two men basically hours after their citizen is released. Um, she's going to be back with her family. I've no ill wishes towards her. I don't know if she's guilty or not. I don't trust Huawei. I think it's a major company. It will have ties to the Communist Party, but I'm not going to judge this woman individually because I don't know. But the two Michaels, I'm pretty much of the persuasion that they have been victims of a political hostage taking, and this is how Beijing behaved. Um, So I would urge all Canadians, all Britons, all Americans, Australians, French nationals, any Westerner who's thinking about working in China, please, please look at the experience of this man and think very carefully about it. Because if you are arrested there, your government can't exactly just release you. They will be in this prolonged situation like Ottawa has been in. But it's great news nonetheless. I'm happy these guys are going back to their families. Um, it's good news in that sense. So it's something to welcome, but it could happen again. Um, China's not the only totalitarian state that engages in hostage diplomacy. I would argue the Iranian regime is doing it with our national, Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe. Again, trumped up charges. They've got very little evidence on her. They keep prolonging her sentence, and God knows what she's going through. So, when dealing with totalitarian dictatorships, it's a very difficult thing because if Western countries notch up the rhetoric, they could just throw on more years under the sentence. It's basically hostage taking as far as I'm concerned. Um, if Beijing had any real evidence on these men, they would have shown it from the start. You know, they would have said this is the equipment they used to spy on us. This is X, Y, and Z. But they had nothing. Um, I think the two Michaels would be within the right to sue the Chinese government, maybe take legal action against them from the safety of Canada. But whether that will happen or whether they'll just want to get on with their lives, I don't know. If I were them, I would seriously consider suing the Chinese embassy or taking some sort of action for the ordeal that they've been through. Probably wouldn't get anywhere, but it would at least send out a message that they have been innocent victims of this. Okay, I don't know that 100%, but it's my gut feeling. Because I think if they were guilty of anything, Beijing would not have hesitated to show it. And they haven't. So, anyway, it's good news, but this could happen again. So, if you're thinking about teaching in China, I'm not saying that this will happen to every Westerner, but I would say just think very carefully about it. Because this happened when I was out there, and I remember feeling wary, just wary. So please do think carefully about it because you might think, oh, I'm just a teacher or I'm just a tourist. But the truth is, the Chinese government is vindictive, nasty, and jingoistic, and they will look for excuses to do this.